So I want to talk to you a little bit about a course that I'm offering. It is EPE 6320, that's its code, but the theme or the idea of it is ethics and literature. So what am I talking about? What am I going to talk about when I say I'm going to offer a course on ethics and literature? That's a good question. Let's start though with sort of a bit of a hand waving exercise, namely the notion of the novel, right? You know, we all read them. Some of us are voracious novel readers or whatever, and some not so much or whatever. But I think there's some things that you commonly hear about novels, and that is their impact, right? So these things have a big impact. You know, there's a history of people wanting to burn novels and dangerous books. You know, various organizations and political thinkers and politicians and religious institutions. They either venerate books, some books that is, and then others they want to destroy. Some books can save you, and others they could destroy you. So there's no question that books have a big impact, and that's a very large sense of the word book and the large sense of the term literature. But I just want to narrow it down a little bit. So thinking about novels again, their impact. So it's not uncommon to hear people say things like, well, I don't know, no, that novel has a very emotional impact. We can unpack the notion of impact in an emotional sense. What? It was very sad. It was frightening. It was funny. It was, deeply moving. I felt, it was a very, very intense kind of emotional experience reading that particular novel. Maybe I was disgusted by it, angered by it, all kinds of things. That a good novel, they can bring all kinds of emotions out in us. And also the idea, it was gripping. I was like, it was a page turner. I couldn't put the novel down, and it was a long lasting kind of grip. That novel stayed with me. I couldn't get it out of my head. And I reread it repeatedly. Many of us have favorite novels that we reread over and over and over. And that's something that we can find in a novel. You always get something new out of it. Yes, granted, we listen to music over and over and over. And so novels are not unique, but there is something very personal and is something different about reading a novel as opposed to, certainly as opposed to watching a movie. But, the relationships between novels and movie is complicated, and that's a story for a different time. But, you can say, there's certain novels that you reread repeatedly. You always get something new. They stay with you. They have a big impact. That's sort of an emotional way. They have a grip on us and whatnot. And I want to introduce just a little distinction that, they also have a cognitive impact on us. Now, whether or not this emotional cognitive distinction is completely viable, that's questionable. We'll talk about that, but that's coming up later. But for now, just for the sake of a short discuss, is promo purposes, shall we say, a cognitive aspect is we often say things like, well, a really good novel will teach us something about the human condition, right? And what does that mean? Well, I read a novel, like maybe it's a historical novel. You read a novel about a certain community and the difficulties it faced and how that affected relationships amongst members of the community and the relationships with the community and the outside world, so to speak. And you learn a lot about human behavior and hopes and dreams and all that kind of stuff. The challenges that people face and what they do about them. And sometimes when they're overcome by the challenges, and sometimes when they surmount the challenges and they achieve something in spite of the difficulties that they face. So you learn about the difficulties and the shall we say the woes of the world and how people engage with them and try to live their lives the best they can. And you sometimes this takeaway, shall we say, is not just simply, it's gripping or whatever, but it's a cognitive takeaway in the sense that, I read a novel about some community or some historical event, or maybe it's today a community that's in my city, even kind of like a next door sort of thing. And I read about this. And, I see things differently now. So you get kind of what we could say is a framework of seeing things. I look at that community differently, or I look at this institution. I read this, political novel, and you know what? I look at the life of politicians differently, and I've reframed this, or whatever the case may be. It can be something where you have a small kind of a framework that is, a subset of society, or maybe you get these big takeaways, like some of those grandiose 19th century novels that are gigantic, sprawling works like a War and Peace, where you think, you know what? I look at history and life and everything in a different way. That was a giant change for me and a giant way of thinking. So you can take away from novels a framework that could be large, it could be small, but in some sense it changes us, right? So this is something that there's an enormous power here in literature. And again, I haven't even really defined what literature is. I'm just sort of trading off the standard things that we all tend to say about it. Now, what am I doing in this course? Well, we're looking at a variety of things, but think about this. Like, what exactly is this reading experience? What is it? A unique kind of an experience? Is it a particular aesthetic experience? How do we describe it? Can it be reduced down to things that are actually in a novel? How does this work? And what should we do about it? Because after all, it has a big impact. Is there anything that we should do? Should we encourage more of it or less or whatnot? These are questions that have been posed and discussed for centuries. But in the end, we hope that that somehow the change is for the better, right? That you become maybe you become a more rational, or maybe more emotionally connected to the world. It all depends. But that in the end, literature is going to change you, and hopefully at the end, provide you with something important, like maybe a richer experience of life. So experience, reading, all these things are connected. The big impact, all that stuff. Now, all right, so a little bit more about the course then. This course, I'm going to break it into two parts. One, I have a little more to say about, one, not so much. The more, I can talk a little bit more about the theoretical angle. Because of its big impact, it's no surprise that philosophers have speculated and wondered a little bit about literature, because it's something important in many people's lives. Now, one of the original concerns was expressed by none other than Plato, one of the founding thinkers of philosophy, at least certainly in the West. Plato basically thought that there was a kind of war, right? We'll unpack this in more detail, but he thought there was kind of war between literature and philosophy. We have to be careful. The poets, that's mainly who he's after here, is the poets are dangerous. He also thought the musicians were dangerous too, because, music is poured directly, into like a funnel is poured directly into your ear, and you can't control it. Beethoven liked to think that a composer had ultimate power. He could make you laugh, cry, whatever, and you couldn't fight it. Literature, Plato thought that the poets were dangerous in this way too. They could get you to believe things. They could get you to be irrational, all kinds of stuff. We got to be careful with them. So there's a kind of war that philosophy has to sort of counter all this. Now, Plato's thoughts really interesting to read, but they're kind of scattered. You can make the more or less that Plato didn't really have a systematic, approach to all this. That really falls to his student Aristotle. He really, took a lot of these concerns and examined them. And we're going to look at Plato's concerns and Aristotle's examination of them. And he presents what more or less could be argued as one of the first in Western thought of, shall we say, a systematic approach to analyzing literature in his work, The Poetics. So we're going to look at that. And Aristotle also looks at, not surprisingly, poetry, both, standard kind of poetry, epic poetry, like the big stuff like, the Homeric stories and things like that. And he also looks at tragedy. So Aristotle, tries to come up with a theoretical account of this. So this is arguably kind of the birth of literary criticism, literary theory. And we'll use those terms as we go along and unpack them as well too. Like, are they the same? Are they different? We'll be checking that out. So in it, these are kind of our anchor texts. There will be more philosophers we'll look at. We'll look a little bit about Kant, a little bit of Hume, and some philosophers of the current era as well. And we'll look at some writers and poets who've also had things to say about interpreting and thinking about literature, like Shelley and Wordsworth, and a few other thinkers. T.S. Eliot probably will pop up as well. And some of the issues we're going to look at in this theoretical part of the course, or like, what exactly, how should one read a literary work? How do we read it to get the most out of it? Do we just approach it randomly and just, whatever we get, or should we be looking for particular things? And also, what is this thing, right? I just talked about, novels. Well, there's some debate actually when the first novel appeared, what actually constitutes a novel versus a novella. And some of these things have changed over time, and sometimes we talk about a short story. Well, what exactly is that? How does this all fit together? So there's lots of theorizing, discussion, and debate over this. And, what is a literary work? Not just almost to characterize it, but is it a standalone kind of object? Is it like a piece of art? And how does that work? How should it be interpreted? Like, should we talk about it in terms of its time, or is it something different? Is it sort of a non-temporal object? And that, of course, relates also to who's producing these things. Well, authors, obviously, flesh and blood people are writing these things, at least for the most part. Someday maybe AI will write these things, which is a whole other topic. But for now, what is an author? Well, yeah, there's a lot of discussions on that, like in the sense of, like, nobody's denying it's a flesh and blood person writing this stuff. But how do we understand? For instance, is the author the ultimate authority on what the author has written, right? So when you think about an author and some author writes something and she says, yeah, that's my book, and this is the way to read it, this is what it means. But authors also, many of them will say they love when readers come up and say, oh, I read your novel and it was very meaningful and this is how it had an impact on me. And many authors will say it's quite delightful when someone says that your book had an impact on me, and the author says, I didn't think anyone would read it that way. I never even thought of reading it that way, and I'm thrilled that it had that kind of an impact. Well, does that impact on the reader not matter? It's like the author, well, you're wrong. You shouldn't have had that impact. I'm going to tell you what the impact is. Is the author the ultimate authority? And so we'll look at that. So, and also then, well, novels aren't going to be meaningful just on their own, right? Just with an author, right? That's more like a diary. But if it's a novel, then it's got to have a reader. Well, what's a reader, right? Like, what do readers bring to the story, right? And so is meaning constituted with some kind of interaction? Is that the right way to put it? Between the, what the author has laid down and then what the reader picks up and what the reader brings in. What exactly are we talking about? There's been a lot of discussion on this one. Another thing about literature, does it really teach us anything? Maybe it has an impact. Does it teach? Right? Does literature philosophize? Are there things that can be in literature, like philosophical views on ethics? Can you learn ethics in a different way than you would learn ethics from you reading a philosophy paper on ethics? So what exactly does, and there are, as writers, like, would novelists say, I can do better or more ethics or ethics differently through a novel than I could through the standard work of a philosophical treatise? And you think Plato wrote in dialogue form. Plato's one of the few authors that's also read as a writer and not just as a philosopher, whereas very few people, if any, would read Aristotle for his writing, right? He doesn't really tell stories the way Plato does. So can literature philosophize? Does it help us? Does it corrupt us? Should we be, was Plato right? We should be reining those poets in, getting those guys and saying, no, we don't want that kind of stuff. We got to pull them in, and maybe we do need censorship. All right, so that will be a chunk of the course there. And then the other part is we're going to look at some novels. I'll be giving some suggestions out. I'll be giving some lectures on various novels and short stories, and we'll analyze them. And we'll look at a variety of them from different genres. And we'll look at analyzing them. And then for your work for the course you will be picking, some literature that you find interesting, and then you can analyze it for its philosophical themes, primarily with an idea to the ethics. Or if you're interested, you could write on some of these theoretical issues. There's no shortage of that. So it's quite open-ended. If you love literature and you've ever been curious about what it really is, what the impact, and wanted to do a little philosophy of it, then this is your course. So I hope you check it out. I'll be posting a syllabus soon. And of course, if you want to talk to me, my name is Dr. Feist. I'm at St. Paul University Faculty of Philosophy, and there is my email address. Feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to talk to you about the course. Thanks for watching.